afternoon, everybody, and very welcome. My name is Ursula Wojciechowska, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of New England Companies for Trade, known as Connect. I also sit on the National Board of the District Export Council, which has 61 chapters around the United States. We have a very timely webinar today on supply chain management, which will be led by George Lauriat, Editor-in-Chief of American Journal of Transportation. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping points. This discussion, it will be recorded and will be available on the NADEC YouTube channel next week. We encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. For details of the two collaborating organizations, please visit the Connect website, connect.org, where you will see details of events and also our annual New England Cargo Symposium, which is taking place on November the 9th. For details of the national DEC events and also the regional local DEC initiatives, please visit usaexporter.org. I will now hand over to George. Thank you, George, very much, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Ursula. Our panelists today are from a wide variety of backgrounds, but it should contribute greatly to our discussion today. We have David Day, Chairman, Global Risk Mitigation Foundation, Co-Chair, Trade Policy Committee of the District Export Council. We have Peter Friedmann, who many of you already know, founder and Counsel Connect. He's also Executive Director of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. Will Marshall, Counsel, I'm going to get this wrong, Will, I'm sorry. Grunfeld, Desiderio, Lebowitz, Silverman, and Klestadt.
Correct.
It's easier when you say
GDLSK.
GDLS and K.
Yeah.
And Dave McLaughlin, COO, CFO, co-founder, Road One Intermodal Logistics, who again, I think many of you already know. And our title today is Untangling the Supply Chain. And since we have a major tangle that seems to be coming our way by the end of the week in the labor problems with rail, I thought we'd start with Dave McLaughlin and see what you have as far as, or I got Will here, but Dave, David, could you give us a kind of a rundown of where we are with as far as labor goes at this moment? You know,
sure, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to. Thank you, George. Again, this is as of this morning. This is the information that we are aware of, and it's coming from several sources. So of the 12 rail unions, 10 have come to agreements and are moving forward. The two holdouts are unfortunately the largest, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, as well as the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, and Rail Transportation Workers. These two groups account for approximately 90,000 of the rail employees that are necessary to operate the trains and maintain the tracks. What I know that, and everyone on this call should be aware of, they are meeting in Washington today with Secretary Marty Walsh to hammer out a deal. You know, we've been keeping an eye on the internet. We've been keeping an eye on the rail websites. We have no news yet. We're hoping that some sort of deal gets worked. There's multiple questions as to what issues are remaining, and we'll discuss that later on. But here's the most important part. According to several sources, this potential strike could have a $2 billion economic impact on the economy. And the severity of this forced the ATA, thankfully, American Trucking Association, to send a letter to both houses stating that if all 7,000 daily long-distance freight trains stopped operations, it would take 460,000 additional trucks per day to pick up the slack. And considering that with 80,000 drivers short right now, the economic impact of a rail strike would create havoc and do nothing but fuel inflationary pressures. That's the latest update I have, George.
Okay, thank you. Peter, what would the, from your perspective, what's the impact of the strike? Where do you see it going right at the moment?
My view is, and here's the challenge. We've been all dealing with three modes that have been under challenge. The West Coast ports, so the ocean mode, to our biggest export markets, which are Asia Pacific by far, and our biggest import source markets, which is Asia Pacific. That's been under stress and uncertainty for months now. We're 3 months into a post-contract environment. There's no longshore contract, and there's some uncertainty. So while we're dealing with that, we have the rail uncertainty now. And we also have truck uncertainty because California, the state of California, and its continuing drive to drive business out of the state of California of all kinds, is now got a new law affirmed by the Supreme Court of the US that says that you can't have independent contractor drivers. So that's going to cost thousands of drivers to hang it up. So those three modes, truck, rail, and ocean, are under extreme pressure. On the ocean, people have, it's not easy, it's expensive, it's disruptive, but there is an alternative. You can, as some have done, shift from a West Coast port gateway to a Gulf or East Coast gateway, and hence in Savannah, they got 8 to 18 days queues for the ships to come in. But that's because people have been able to shift. A rail that we're talking about, there is no alternative. As David just said, you got 500,000 new trucks you got to find and 500,000 new drivers. You're not going to do that. So there is no alternative. Things just shut down. And that's the situation we're fearful of now. Now you have production that stops. You have agriculture that stops. You have hogs that don't stop growing, but they still are going to be somehow got to get into a processing facility. The processing facility's got to be able to process and ship that product out to Asia. Our cold storage facilities across the United States, totally chock-a-block now. And when you stop providing rail service and truck service and ocean service, what do you do with the product? If it's a perishable reefer, you have to put it into cold storage, you freeze it. What do you do when there's no more cold storage capacity, as it is the case now? So that's the calamity, and it's on all fronts, in all parts of the country. There's nobody immune from this, whether you're a primary rail user or your primary used truck. If you got it, a truck brought it, right? But that was for David. But aside from that, aside from that, if you're using any manufactured product, a lot of that's coming by rail. So the challenge here is all around us. We had a meeting a couple hours ago with General Stephen Lyons, who's the White House's appointed supply chain master, if you will. And I have to say, my impression is there's a lot of meetings going on, but there have been a lot of meetings going on. I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction. I may be wrong. I hope I'm not. I think that the two unions and the railroads will not reach an agreement, but will not go on strike. And they will possibly limp along. They will agree to continue working to a resolution. The president and his party can ill afford shutting down the economy because you shut it down for a day, it'll take probably 10 days for every day it's shut down with a rail. And that takes us pretty quickly to the midterm elections. So every organization I know of is up on the Hill, has been on the Hill. There's yet another letter going up to the Hill today at 5 o'clock, 5:30, signed by every trade association imaginable. But frankly, what are we telling people on the Hill? There could be a rail strike. It could impact the midterm elections. They know it. And I suspect all of this has made the president's little trip to England to visit, the royal family a little less relaxing. But I think this is unprecedented, and I turn it over to everybody else here. And David, are you aware that we've had situations where the major transportation modes are all in jeopardy at the same time? This is quite unique.
It is unique, Peter. I have one brief update. It's not a huge update, but it's an update. The Norfolk Southern, effective 5 o'clock tonight, was scheduled to close all its gates to intermodal traffic. And they're saying this out of safety and operational demands. They're afraid to take any international traffic. So if it's already moving and it's on the rail, they'll get it delivered, but they're not taking it. Now, this was extended twice already. Originally, the deadline was supposed to be on Tuesday. Then they moved it to Tuesday. Then they moved it to today at noontime, and then they moved it today at 5 o'clock. And it's less than an hour away, and I'm not seeing this extended. And also a minor update: the big four, UP, BNSF, CSX, are also restricting hazmat traffic in any type of special secured type of cargo or hot transit cargo. So they've stopped that as well. So
Can you blame them?
No, I can't.
This is a situation. It's a little different, George, than often where you have the shippers on one side and the carriers on the other side. This is one. Can you blame our carriers, the railroads, for not wanting to send trains heading west or east, wherever, and risk having that thing pulled over on a siding, or not even on a siding, in the middle of Wyoming? And at the same time, nobody can ship unless you want to risk your cargo on that train in the middle of Wyoming. For how long?
Peter, do you think
we're in the same situation now, the carrier and the shipper?
Do you think if they do extend it, they will put a specific time period on how they extend these types of negotiations? In other words, so they won't say there's like we've got 20 days or so. So from the point of view of the supply chain, it's going to be one crisis more. Every moment's going to be in crisis, basically.
Every moment is a crisis, because while David mentioned hazmat, think about refrigerated. It's equally vulnerable, if you will. And nobody wants to put their reefer cargo on anything that is in danger of running out of fuel to keep the coolers going. I just think they're going to continue to kind of work through this and keep everybody on edge. And frankly, if I'm the union, you got to have leverage, right? And if you provide, and leverage is uncertainty. Uncertainty is your leverage. So we'll see. And this is one where the president, who has bragged repeatedly about being the president closest to organized labor, to labor unions, as any president has ever been. And he's right. That's one thing President brags about. He's accurate in that one. He is closer to organized labor than anybody else. And now we're going to see whether it goes both ways, whether it's just him supporting the unions, or whether his friends at the unions are going to support him by not bringing the economy to a halt before the midterm elections.
It's sort of, since this is sort of, we're going to be put in a wait and see anyway. It's kind of rather like that train coming down the track that may run you over or may not. Let's move on to some of the other problems that we're looking at. And we have the West Coast, which is a whole collection of things. And for the moment, we can go back to, we mentioned it briefly about the with the situation with AB5. And I know that you and David have already talked about these things in the past, but why don't we try to go back and where you think it is and where you think it will be going? Because that also fits into this disruptive situation, not just now, but going forward. So
I think the AB5 is the independent contractor that California decided that they don't want independent contractors. Mostly, I don't think the legislature decided anything. It was the Teamsters who decided you can't organize independent contractors. So if they're all employees, they can be organized. And the Teamsters hold a fair amount of sway in California. And so the Supreme Court has agreed with them that, you know, if you're a driver, and David can go into some specifics, but most of those drivers can arguably fit in the category mandatorily as employees rather than independent contractors. The difficulty here to remember is that the same is true in Washington State. The Teamsters hold a lot of sway in that state legislature, and the party that's in the majority in both California and Washington State are the same, close to the Teamsters. And there's talk about that migrating up the coast, which would be very dangerous as well. So I'll turn it over to George, because there's a lot of David, because there's a lot of conjecture as to how many drivers will actually make a transition or drop out.
Yeah, let me just give a recap on that. So this all started when a particular lawsuit that was supposed to be, we thought would be heard by the Supreme Court, considering we thought it was a conservative court, refused to hear the case. So what happened is it reverted back to the Ninth Circuit Court, which basically said that the AB5, there's an ABC rule, and it's the B part of the rule that says that the individual, if the individual is providing services in the same business that the other individual is, then they must be considered employees. So it's the B portion of the test that no one can comply with. And if I think you remember, George, I used the case of a freelance writer, right, in California, would fall into that category too. So what happened was, when they didn't hear it, the Supreme Court lifted the temporary injunction on August 29th, and AB5 is now the law of the land. So technically, to Peter's comment, the independent contractor model is dead in California. Now, there are some things that can be done. These independent contractors can go out, apply for their own authority, get their own SCAT codes, get their own insurance, and still try to operate as an independent driver and use the business-to-business exemption, which is a possibility. But it does put a lot of burden on these drivers, a lot of additional costs, a lot of additional regulatory pressures and items that they have to comply with, where being an independent contractor, they would be operating under someone else's authority, and they would be providing that information. So what I think you're going to see is there's a lot of drivers here that are just going to find something else to do, and you're going to see a sharp increase. This is just my opinion. I am not an expert in California law or California operations by any stretch of the imagination, but one would think that there's going to be a driver fallout, which would conversely, create shortages and would, artificially at least for some period, drive up pricing. Now, I'd also like to point out, in addition to that, you have the California Air Resource Board CARB regulations.
Right.
That's also pending on a January 1st, 2023 regulation, where any truck that's model year 2009 or older, which would be model year 2010, would be barred from operating in the state of California. So now you have the independent contractor issue that we're dealing with. Come January, which is not a long time away by any stretch of the imagination, there's another 76,000 trucks, according to the California Trucking Association. I'm getting this information from them. This is not coming from me. That would be barred from operating in the state of California. So supply and demand would indicate to me that there's going to be a substantial increase in costs of operating, especially drayage and trucking in the state of California.
Let's, now that we've really ruined everyone's day, let's move on to something else that's a little bit different. More to the sort of the bigger picture things for the moment. Everybody's been talking about the different sanctions and so forth, and we've all talked about, you know, what's happening with Ukraine, Russia, and obviously I don't know if you'd call it a decoupling from China, since we have an amazing amount of goods still moving back and forth. But let's start talking about how that might look going forward. And so why don't we, David, that's your expertise. So could you sort of fill us in where things sit with that, or where we are with it?
Sure, and George, just before I do that, let me just add one comment to the wonderful discussion between Peter and David here on this California trucking situation. I think if you add all those pieces together, the bottom line is they may solve one of those problems, but they aren't going to solve, California is not going to solve all of them. And so what that means to me as the token member on this panel from the western part of the country is, I think what we're going to see is the long term, the West Coast ports are going to see a decrease in shipping and enhanced importance of our Gulf and East Coast ports over time. And that's assuming we don't have any kind of problem involving a blockade of the Taiwan Straits or the Luzon Straits or the channel with between Taiwan and Japan, because that's a very, very heavy shipping area. But to your question, George, the issue of sanctions is one that I think that all of us need to be very aware of. And of course, we have the standard 301 sanctions against China for intellectual property violations and that type of thing. But it's the Russia sanctions that are the most troublesome, because that's a very onerous sanction regime. And those of you out there in the audience may be saying, well, it doesn't apply to me. I don't do business with Russia. And my response is, well, hold on a second now. The Russia sanctions regime, number one, recognize that they are brutal. And between Treasury and Commerce, your firm gets on one of those blacklists, you will really regret it from a reputation standpoint. But there are a number of firms that the Commerce Department at the end of June has snagged that are not Russian firms. These are firms from the Middle East and from India. And the reason that Commerce snagged those is that they are doing business supporting the Russian war effort. And I understand that, or we understand from our trade policy group, that Commerce has another whole packload of Chinese firms that are in their crosshairs that they may nail in the Russia sanctions regime for helping the war effort. So here's where the challenge comes for our companies, and that is that you got to be very careful if you're selling or exporting to a third party as to who the end user really is. And so that's a challenge. You may need to develop an end user certificate so that you don't get caught in this. And then my final comment on this is as follows. We haven't had a situation in our careers where, generally speaking, the prospect of your business being hit with some type of reputational damage. And that is why this Russia sanctions thing is so troublesome, as we see the war crimes issues being unfolded in the Ukraine. I mean, I think it's very important that you want to keep your company well away from any kind of accusation that you were helping or a part of this, even indirectly. So I hope that answers your question, George.
Yeah. Will, I have you were talking about the Bureau of Industry and Security.
Yes.
Could you sort of give us of the background and what do you see for the enforcement and penalties that are coming up?
Sure. Yeah. So further to some of the comments that David was making, you know, enforcement of export controls has been, you know, probably unimpressive when you compare it to some other administrative enforcement regimes, like even customs or the IRS. You know, there haven't been many financial penalties assessed, and those financial penalties that have been assessed have not been very large. But you know, given the increased use of export controls now as a political tool and as a foreign policy tool for the government, BIS has decided to revise its internal enforcement policies this summer. So in early July, they released an internal memorandum, which they made public, which sort of outlines their goals on increasing enforcement. So first and foremost, the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is part of the Department of Commerce, they will start using aggravation factors when they are reviewing possible enforcement actions. So, you know, in the past, there obviously mitigation factors is something that everyone is very familiar with. You know, maybe there was inadvertent clerical errors, things of that nature that could voluntary disclosures, things that could mitigate down penalties. Well, the BIS is now going to be looking at aggravation factors. So the nature of the foundational or strategic nature of the technologies that may have been traded, the parties to whom those technologies or products were shipped, and what end uses to which they were put will potentially increase penalties, which is a new development. Also, BIS had a longstanding practice of accepting no admission settlements. So an exporter who may have inadvertently run afoul of the export control regulatory scheme could have made a voluntary disclosure and you know, or been subject to an enforcement investigation from BIS. And in resolving that, they could make an admission letter without specifically admitting guilt and mitigate down penalties. Well, BIS is no longer accepting no admission or denial resolutions. And that comes in on the heels of making those settlement letters now public. So to the point that David was making about you know, reputational damage involved, you know, export control violations, you know, particularly as they relate to China. You know, I think the compliance there is difficult given some of the end user restrictions. You know, the military end user is very much at the core of BIS's enforcement focus, and determining who's a military end user in China is not always straightforward. And so where there may be an enforcement action, you know, making no admission or not making any denial is no longer an option, and that settlement letter will become public. So it raises the stakes quite a lot for internal compliance staff at companies. And the last thing I'll mention is BIS is now going to be fast tracking the enforcement. So what they consider to be relatively minor violations, they will handle on a 60-day fast track basis. where, more significant cases that, again, based on the type of technology, who it was shipped to, and end uses to which it may have been put, will have a more careful investigation, and referrals will be made to the Department of Justice. So something to keep in mind here is obviously the heightened enforcement environment, the scrutiny to which shippers will be put. And then finally is if a voluntary self-reporting is contemplated, please bear in mind that a voluntary report to BIS will not cover you for the Department of Justice. So you'll need to do a separate one. And so those are things to keep in mind there.
So what does an exporter have as recourse? I mean, when they start getting entangled?
Well, I mean, I think there's several ways, that shippers can protect themselves. First and foremost is having a good grip on the categories, the commerce control lists, the CCL numbers under which your products are classified, to have a good grasp on the control status of the products that you're shipping. Secondarily, I think, is having a careful and thorough end user due diligence program, particularly where you're shipping to China. Ensuring that you don't have potential military end users in your supply chain is going to be important. And I have clients who ship or sell technology products that are used in academic research, logic analyzers, things of that nature. And trying to separate universities in China from being considered potentially military end users is not so easy. Some of them have research institutions within the university that are proud of research that they've done in conjunction with the People's Liberation Army, just like we have here in the United States. And those are red flags, and I would encourage all shippers to spot and resolve red flags before sales are made and shipments are completed. And so I think it all comes down to really the basic blocking and tackling with respect to your compliance programs and careful due diligence on end users.
Thank you. Peter, one thing I was wondering about was, and you had mentioned that there may be the Ocean Shipping Reform Act might be because of the circumstances, a lot of things could change. And I'd like to return to that because you had mentioned that in an earlier conversation. I'd like to hear more about it.
Sure. Look at the fact of the matter is that congestion continues. I think, in fact, the congestion and disruption of the supply chain continues and grows together with ocean carriers' announced profits. It seems that the worse the congestion is, the more profitable the business is for the ocean carriers. This is not unnoticed by the administration or Congress. It is stimulating some discussion of antitrust implications and some antitrust enforcement as the carriers continue to blank sailings, restrict capacity, keep rates up, and seemingly profit more and more the worse the congestion is.
Does any of this address alliances specifically?
Well, alliances would be part of it if alliances are a conduit by which carriers can control, manipulate capacity. And the carriers will say, no, they absolutely don't, and they can't, and so forth. Antitrust people in and outside the government say, look, if you got 4 carriers putting their stuff on one ship, they're obviously working together. So the opportunity to communicate is quite high. Whether they actually do talk about, reducing the amount of cargo they're going to put on a particular ship and agree on blanking some sailing, but not others, that's another story. If they are, you have to prove it, but that would be a violation. Now, people are concerned. The Federal Maritime Commission has just today had a deadline for submission of information in a public docket 2219-19, where they are asking if there is an emergency situation, if the congestion at the ports compromises an emergency situation, which requires further intervention, and according to the people on Hill, further legislation to address that congestion. At the same time, there was a rather comprehensive story that's circulating in the trade press and others, George, you know that, where the Ocean Shipping Reform Act requirements for information that is to mandatorily accompany any detention demurrage invoice is in fact not being submitted with such invoices. That is a straight out violation of the statutory mandate. This previously there was an interpretive rule, which some people interpreted it as a kind of guidance and recommendation for information. It wasn't. It was mandatory. The carriers ignored it. That led to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which had that information requirement. Carriers are again ignoring it. And we're going to see whether some of the very aggravated Federal Maritime commissioners and members of Congress who passed the bill, and perhaps the big cheese himself, the president, who with great fanfare signed this Ocean Shipping Reform Act, are going to take some umbrage with the fact that the ocean carriers are ignoring one of the central components of that Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and whether they're going to come back in and try to impose further, more stringent requirements with mandatory penalties. So we're going to see what happens. But there's a lot stirring around right now at the FMC, in the public entity, at the Department of Justice, also the Council of Economic Advisors. Members of Congress, issued a lot of press releases, and the president issued a lot of press releases and, bragging about this great accomplishment. But it's not such a great accomplishment if the parties that are supposed to change their ways aren't doing so.
One question I had that was from comments you had made previously was, does the FMC have enough, for lack of a better word, people to become a regulatory authority to follow all this? So can they, in other words, can they handle this new load?
Well, for 40 years, well, more or less, since the Shipping Act of '84, the FMC gave as the reason that they were not able to, really enforce the Shipping Act, it's because they didn't have the authority. And that was sort of the mantra there. You kept hearing it from staff and many of the commissioners. We don't have the authority. So Congress said, okay, we're going to give you the authority. Now you will recall that in early June, late May, the FMC issued a $2 million penalty to Hapag-Lloyd for violation of some of the regulations, and another $880,000 to Wanhai Lines. This was done over a month before the Ocean Shipping Reform Act was supposedly giving the commission authority passed. It wasn't even law yet.
Right.
So somehow the commission found the authority that it had been saying it lacked for 30 plus years to actually take action for the first time. They had never imposed penalties like this or of any kind against the carriers. So all of a sudden they found the authority. Did they find the authority? Wasn't it there all along? Yes, it was there all along. What they lacked was the will. And when they saw the Ocean Shipping Reform Act coming down, when they saw the president planning a signing ceremony, all of a sudden they have the will. And all of a sudden, for the first time, there are now at the FMC 5 commissioners all of whom believe that their job is to look out for the interest of the US public, the US shipping public, and not necessarily, to get themselves in the good graces of the ocean carrier lawyers in town here. We had never had all 5 commissioners on board until about a couple, 3 years ago. So that's been very helpful. So they found the will. Now the mantra is, we don't have the staff. We don't have the budget. Well, in my view, they have the staff, they have the budget, they have the authority. They need the will to take on the sacred cows of these ocean carriers. When you go walk around the Federal Maritime Commission, you go down the halls, you see a lot of models and posters of big ships. In my view, they ought to have models and posters of piles of corn and hay cubes and shoes, and all the cargo that moves in and out of this country, because that should be their motivation. But I believe they have the authority, they have the capacity, they have the budget, they have the personnel, they need the will.
I think, David, since you have on the Export Council, what have you guys looked at the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and sort of what's your take on it?
The answer to that is yes, but we have a divided committee on this, and I think that we've got some meetings coming up this fall where we need to get a little bit more educated on this issue with some of our committee members. So the answer is we've been discussing it, but there really isn't a position that I can talk about yet publicly because it's not there.
But it does seem like we're in a situation, though, that's quite unusual. I think the federal FMC historically did side with the ship owners, but of course, over the decades, U.S. ship owners have sort of vanished, and it is a very peculiar situation that an organization that essentially was founded around, taking care of the ship owners now finds himself having to take care of the shippers who are far outnumber the ship owners. But
well, absolutely, and most of those shippers are from the People's Republic of China. So
yeah.
that's a very interesting twist on this whole thing, George.
Mm-hmm. Let me. I would like to go back to a little bit on China as well. If we we got to keep our watch on time here, but on some of the, we briefly hit on some of those sanctions that were, and some of the things that have happened in China. But as far as for supply chains, there's this whole theory of China. Then it was, China +1, and then it was Asia. Now it's Asia +1. There's a real shift in supply chains in general. I'd like to get your take on that, especially since you're on the export side of this thing and the shifting of the supply chains.
Well, I mean, this is absolutely the big picture, and you're correct, George. I mean, what started out prior to during the home stretch of the Obama administration was that we had increased labor costs in China and product costs. And so you started to see a little bit of a bleed out of US and foreign companies. And then that process accelerated with the so-called tariff war, and then COVID lockdowns, and now you got the Russia sanction situation, so that there are an enormous number of companies moving out of China. And the issue then is, where do they go? How do they rebuild these supply chains? And so one of the big focuses that we have had as the Export Council is looking at alternative markets. And as we look at those, I mean, the first one that comes to mind, of course, is Vietnam. Another one is India. Those two markets have seen a real boom with, as an example, Apple and Foxconn moving into both of those countries. But with this Russia sanction situation and the ties of those two countries to Russia, I'm not so sure that that's a low risk proposition. And so we have been looking at markets trying to get things developed more in the Americas here. And our trade policy committee has developed a whole new trade initiative, which we're about ready to unroll with the US government. It's called the Southbound Trade Initiative, and it's essentially the USMCA on steroids to pick up the entire hemisphere. And we do have some real challenges with this, because now we have a number of leftist governments taking over in Chile and Argentina. And I think Colombia was another one recently that posed some problems. But we have a patchwork of foreign free trade agreements in the Americas that have been essentially left fallow. So this is an area that we're trying to focus on, in addition to our own USMCA, which is the most highly integrated trade bloc in the country. The current trade negotiations that were underway in the prior administration with the UK and the EU have simply fallen by the wayside. They're not going to go anywhere. But I'm hopeful that we can revive some private sector to private sector deals with the UK as well as with the EU. And that's kind of the big picture with where this whole sanctions regime and COVID lockdowns. I really don't think we're going to see the Communist Party leadership back off of these COVID lockdowns. And this means that the supply chains and the shipping coming out of China is going to be a mess for quite some time to come. And let me make one final comment. We had a reference in our chat about the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, or the other name for it is the Forced Labor or Slave Labor Act. This is an export issue if the components being included in the product for export are coming out of Xinjiang. And so this is another sanctions regime that is put into place and is now active this year, and it's caused quite a bit of problem with American importers who then may use those products built into their eventual export.
Yeah, this is, on the human rights policy.
Right.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the other thing that was recently added to that was the idea of Russian goods, particularly lumber and things like that, being funneled into China to be made into Chinese products, and where something like that would fall as far as sanctions go, since it seems like it might even be a double whammy on that one.
Right, and there are other products that are seemingly very innocuous. Lumber is one. One of them is I saw some discussion about pencils and export of pencils to China that were being in turn exported across the border to Russia. And were those pencils assisting the PLA? And this comes back to the really excellent discussion from Will about the importance of really knowing your supply chain. And this is one of the practical tips I hope people will take away from this program, is that it is critical that you really audit your own supply chain, and you know the bits and pieces of it, every nook and cranny, because you don't want to be in a situation like the production of the F-35, where there's a magnet that all of a sudden is down in the supply chain that causes all kinds of problems.
Well, what is your thoughts on the way this is playing out with the ban? It looks like a very complex, because of the combination of Russia and China.
Yeah, look, particularly this year, there have been obviously a series of executive orders from Biden, and then subsequent directives from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, to implement those Russian-related sanctions that Biden announced in his executive orders. and some of them have included import bans as well. So definitely, I think that there's almost no shipper or importer in the United States that can afford to sleep on these changes. So we often recommend that our clients check. There's a consolidated screening list that's available at the Department of Commerce website. So that's a great place to start if you're on the export side. And if you're on the import side, you know, obviously checking in with, you know, import bans that have been issued. For example, you know, diamonds from Russia, just as one example. You know, and as those products may continue to evolve, you know, it's important to stay up to date with what's happening. But in further to those import bans, you know, I think what David mentioned is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You know, Customs has been slowly but surely getting itself up to speed with enforcing that act, that law. And if there's any, you know, forced labor that is incorporated into those products that are imported into the United States from China that may have been made with Uyghur forced labor, and that may not be sourced from Xinjiang, it could be from any other parts of China, and even potentially from other countries outside of China that may be using China inputs. One example is wearing apparel. So cotton is one of the biggest products that is produced in Xinjiang. So fabric that may be milled using Xinjiang cotton will often make its way to Vietnam to be cut and sewn into wearing apparel. And I think we haven't yet seen the wave or the full extent of customs enforcement of that Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so due diligence is definitely the term for today. Due diligence in your supply chain, and not just your first tier suppliers, but your second tier suppliers, trying to get a grip on, you know, where the raw materials are coming from to go to the factories that are producing the goods that you're buying and importing is going to be key to try to avoid, you know, a detention at the border that you may not be prepared for. So I think whether you're export or import, due diligence is going to be the term to follow.
It's going to change the way we do it, though, isn't it?
It is. You know, one of my colleagues here just today was discussing the difficulty of proving a negative. So proving that your product doesn't incorporate, you know, certain inputs from Xinjiang can be a difficult undertaking. So, you know, obviously having full and complete information on your supply chain and record keeping. You know, a lot of the Chinese suppliers or Vietnamese suppliers or Cambodian suppliers, they may not have records that they've retained that would satisfy customs. And so I think even if you haven't had a detention yet, going through the exercise on due diligence to see what documents you can actually obtain, what they look like, and how you know, credible they appear, I think is a worthwhile exercise in order to prepare yourself for what is inevitable, which is, you know, customs stepped up enforcement of that Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Thank you. Well, we're getting down to the 10-minute mark here, so I think we're going to first see if anyone wants to chime in and needs answers. And for that, and otherwise, I'm going to go to sort of the questions for the last 10 minutes that kind of came out of the discussions. And one of them, which both Peter and Davey came up with, was actually all of you have, is what would happen if more ships moved out of the West Coast and moved to the East Coast. Quite frankly, can the East Coast actually accept many more ships? I mean, I was told that we could only accept about 10% increase from the West Coast if that was a diversion. I'm not sure.
I would say that the shift is old news.
Yeah, I agree with that.
This shift is not going to happen.
It is
It
happening.
has happened and is continuing. I think that West Coast market share has dropped from in the low 70%
Right.
now into the mid to low 40%, somewhere around there, George, you know the numbers, but somewhere around that. So that's a massive shift. Now, the other thing is when you're talking about capacity expansion opportunities,
It would be here.
you know, anybody needs to do, just go for a drive to the Port of Charleston, go to the drive to Port of Savannah and Norfolk. On your drive into the port, you're off the highway already and you're driving to the port, you are passing thousands of acres of land that could be developed, are being developed. In LA, Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, you've got maybe inches of land that could be developed and you wouldn't even get to a foot. I mean, it is jammed between the water and downtown. And further, Georgia, South Carolina,
Right.
Virginia, unlike the West Coast ports, those ports are located in states that are aggressively pursuing economic growth and prefer not to put barriers to development and prefer to find solutions to environmental challenges. Also don't exist on the West Coast. So all those thousands of acres can be developed, are being developed, and nobody thought that they would grow as fast as they've been growing. And so all we need is that current trajectory to continue. The problem is our biggest markets are still in Asia Pacific, our biggest
Exactly.
force is Asia Pacific, and the West Coast is still the closest.
So let me add an accelerator to Peter's excellent comment, and that is that China, under its Belt and Road, has developed and announced, I guess 3 years ago, relatively recently, this Arctic Silk Road, which is has been successfully implemented. They're talking about it now, but in February of 2021, they made the first Russian icebreaker move through the Arctic during the winter months. So essentially, depending on how the Arctic ice evolves, there's a much shorter route from Asia to coming into Newfoundland, Greenland, Northern Europe, as well as into the North America through the Arctic. It's much shorter than going through Suez and so that may be an accelerator to the trend that Peter has just mentioned that we'll see long term.
Yeah, to David's point, I did a little research on that. In the travel time, you can take off about 13 days on transit time. Again, the dangers are, as you mentioned, David, icebergs, and there is a smaller window without an icebreaker, July to November, but you're looking at 35 versus 45 days. So that's a big plus. And it'll be interesting to see if this truly develops into a valuable trade lane.
So David, I participated in a big program on this with the American Bar Association. And one of the things that the Canadian experts are looking at is, oh my Lord, we've got a problem now because we've got the potential for year-round Chinese shipping coming through the Arctic. And they may elect to take another route, the Northwest Passage, which cuts through the Canadian archipelago. And this is another security challenge for Canada. But the bottom line of this whole Arctic thing, David, is, as you rightly point out, is, this is going to put additional capacity enhancement, if you will, or incentives for the development of our ports on the East Coast and on the Gulf states. And I think Peter's comment about an inch left for growth is probably precisely correct.
Yeah. And I would point out one more thing. If you look at the vessel backup right now, it's actually shifted from the West Coast to the East Coast. The number one vessels at anchor right now is Savannah, although the turn time is much quicker at 39. This was as of yesterday. Number two, believe it or not, is Houston at 18. 3 is Oakland at 14, and number 4 is Long Beach and LA at 8. So that was interesting. But I would like to point out on the Savannah, even though there's a backup, what we're seeing is the turn times are still exceptionally well. We're still getting 4 turns a day out of there. The average turn time is 1 to 4 hours in the morning. It goes to about 2+ in the afternoon. So in spite of the extra capacity that they're seeing through that, the throughput, we're not seeing a degradation in the turn times. And that's pretty impressive.
Awesome.
The only thing I found was we did an article about a year ago on it, and the Canadian government wasn't terribly fond of the idea of Chinese transits, and came down pretty hard on that idea. But
well, that's a huge rift between the Canadian government and our State Department, because our State Department wants those waters through the Canadian archipelago to remain international waters. And the Canadian government wants sovereign control. And so there's a little friction there between the two governments.
Well, that along with logs should make it interesting.
That's true.
Well, we just gotta wait till the Chinese government just decides, like the South China Sea, it's theirs. They'll just take it over. They'll build an island up there and then claim 250 miles all around it in the middle of the Arctic.
Well, I think we're almost out of our time. So I'd like to thank the panel, and I think we could have done another hour, except that Peter does have to go. And I really appreciate all the effort that everybody put into this. This was really, really, really good. Ursula, do you have any last minute words for us, or I think we're...
No, I would just like to thank all the panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we were not going to let you off the hook. We'll do a continuation webinar in the new year to see what happens.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.